Gold don't matter here. What we need is you. The words cut through the burning stillness of a Kansas noon. Clara, a frail black widow, had gone 3 days with nothing but crumbs. Her stomach knotted until her sight blurred. Trembling, she clutched her wedding band, the last token of her late husband, the vow she had sworn to keep forever. Now it had become her only hope to trade for cornmeal, to buy a few more days of breath. The storekeeper brushed her aside, cold and sharp. Another drifter leaned in with a slick smile, dangling food and shelter in exchange for a bitter price. And just as the ground seemed to give way beneath her, that steady voice rose, firm, warm, a hand reaching through the dust, planting the first seed of a fate she never could have foreseen. Noon in Kansas. The sun hung overhead like a block of fire refusing to give way, pouring down a glare so fierce the dusty road itself glimmered like live coal. Cornfields in the distance lay shriveled, their leaves curled from drought. No breeze stirred, only a heavy stillness that pressed on the chest like a kiln. Clara Whitmore stood beneath the wooden awning of Holbrook's general store, sweat running down the collar of her faded dress. Her hem was frayed, shoes worn through at the toes. In her hand, she held tight a gold wedding band, the last keepsake left to her. The door creaked as she stepped inside. The air reeked of wheat, dry salt, and pig lard. Dusty light cut through a small window and fell across old sacks of flour. Behind the counter slouched Holbrook, a paunchy man with a silvered mustache, who barely raised his head when Clara came forward. Her trembling hand set the ring on the scarred wood. Brown eyes pleading. Her voice cracked from hunger. "Please. Just a little flour or corn, enough to last a few days." Holbrook grunted, flicked the ring back with a fat finger. "Gold won't feed a soul out here. Folks need work, not trinkets. Widow, best find a job. Don't waste my time." The words struck like cold water. Her belly knotted. 3 days she'd survived on scraps. Pride had kept her from begging, but pride was a luxury she could no longer carry. She snatched up the ring, meaning to turn away, but her legs wavered beneath her. Then boots struck hard against the planks. A stranger loomed at her back, tall, shifty-eyed, grinning wide enough to show yellow teeth. "Heard your trouble, ma'am," he drawled, eyes crawling over her like a snake. "If it's food you want, I got a place. Work for me, keep house. You won't go hungry." The meaning in his tone chilled her. She backed away, hand clutching her chest. Around them, a few townsfolk glanced up, then dropped their gaze, feigning busyness. Out here, a black widow had no defenders. The man stepped closer, slick words rolling off his tongue. "Better than starving where you stand." Her throat was too dry for protest. And then, suddenly, a shadow cut between them. A lean man stood there, broad-shouldered beneath a sun-bleached shirt, face worn by the plains, eyes dark as Kansas soil. His voice carried low and steady. "Enough, Turner. Everyone knows you prey on newcomers. Get out, or I'll throw you out." Turner's grin faltered. Muttering curses, he slunk back into the glare of the street. The store hushed. Clara shook where she stood. The man who'd stepped in didn't look her way at once. He pulled coins from his pocket, set them down firm on the counter. "Flour, salt pork, corn. Put it on my account." Holbrook scowled, but the man's steady gaze silenced him. Then he turned, his hand gesturing lightly. "Keep the ring. Don't sell off what still carries memory." Her eyes blurred. She whispered, broken. "But I've nothing else." The man tipped his head, a warmth beneath the grit of his tone. "Gold don't matter here. What we need is you." The words cut through her like a blade, breaking the ice around her heart. She saw him then. No fine clothes, no polish, only plain steadiness, a presence that carried shelter instead of threat. "Samuel," he said simply. "Grant Place, north of town. We need a hand. A kitchen fire gone cold. You could tend it." She clutched the ring, torn between fear of the unknown and the gnawing hunger in her belly. Holbrook shoved forward a bundle of flour, pork, and corn. It was more choice than she'd had in days. Samuel gave a small nod. "At the ranch, no one will strip you of memory, but they need you to bring life back to the hearth." Clara lifted her gaze. Beyond the doorway, sun still blazed merciless, dust hanging like smoke. Yet before her, standing in the harsh light, Samuel looked carved from the same earth, steady enough to bear the weight of others. Her fingers tightened around the food, the ring clenched in her other hand. With what strength she had left, she gave the faintest nod. Samuel's mouth bent in a quiet smile. He pushed open the door, waiting for her to follow. His tall frame faded into the brightness. Clara stepped after him, burdened yet stirred by a flicker of hope. That searing day, in a town hardened by drought and indifference, Clara Whitmore was not left to stand alone. And Samuel Grant, the man in the sunlight, laid the first stone of a road she had never imagined she would walk. Holbrook's main street lay silent under the burning noon sun. Wooden signs creaked on rusted chains each time the dry wind scraped past. Clara Whitmore moved slowly through the red dust. Her shoes split at the toes, heels worn flat. Her dress was faded, stitched over and over, her headscarf threadbare, unable to hide the sweat-matted strands of hair. Passers-by faltered at the sight of her. A young black widow, thin as bone, staggering as though one more day of heat might topple her where she stood. In her clenched hand, something caught the sun, a gold wedding band, the last remnant left to her after sickness and loss. Once Thomas had slipped it onto her finger on a morning filled with light, when they believed their future stretched as wide as the prairie. Now it was only a fragile tether to a past already gone. 3 days had passed since she had eaten more than water and crumbs. She had traded her last wool shawl for a moldy loaf, cutting it into small pieces to make it last. Each night in the shell of an abandoned stable, her stomach had roared so loud she could not sleep. Yet hunger was not as cruel as memory. Thomas had died in a fevered summer night, so sudden she had not understood it until he was gone. The little house in Missouri was seized by the bank. In one season she lost her husband, her home, her place in the world. All that remained was her thin body and this ring. Clara lifted it to her lips, eyes closed. She had sworn to keep it till her last breath, no matter the hardship. It was not just gold. It was memory, a promise, proof she had once been loved. But hunger had its own voice, and it whispered of flour, beans, bread. The ring might buy her days of life. To keep it might mean death. Her chest tightened with the pull of pride and the grip of need. Pride urged her to endure, to never bow her head. But her body cried for food. On the street, glances slid over her, some pitying, others sharp with scorn. Whispers stirred, a dry laugh broke. Here, a black widow was nothing but a burden. No hand reached out. She drew the scarf closer, trying to hide. Yet each step grew heavier, dragging shame and despair. At last her eyes fixed on the faded sign. Holbrook's General Store. The only place in town. Behind its dusty glass lay sacks of flour, jars of beans, strips of salt pork, treasures beyond reach. Her hand shook, clutching the ring. She drew a breath, heart pounding. If she walked through that door, she was surrendering, ready to set her last keepsake against hunger. The thought nearly broke her, but the searing heat, the hollow ache, the growl in her belly pressed her on. One step, then another. Her shadow stretched long across the warped planks. Each footfall landed like a drumbeat. Sweat slicked her palm, the ring biting into her fingers. At the door, she paused. Her chest ached, tears pricking her eyes. She whispered so soft only the dust could hear. "Forgive me, Thomas." The hinge groaned as she pushed inside. So. Sound dry as a verdict. The air struck her, grain and brine, stifling heat. A ceiling fan turned slow as if weary. A few customers glanced her way, then looked off. Clara moved toward the counter, fist closed tight. The ring burned in her palm like a coal. Her voice came out raw, near a whisper. "Please, trade me a little food." In that instant the world slowed. The wind outside, the echo of hooves, the light spilling across the floor, all blurred away. There was only Clara, the trembling ring set down on scarred wood, and the thin thread of hope that it might buy her a loaf to live another day. In that moment, she wagered everything, love lost, pride, even her soul on the chance of surviving. And that step, that hand setting down the ring, drew her toward an encounter she could never have foreseen, beneath the merciless sun of Kansas. The wagon rattled down the red dirt road that stretched beyond Holbrook, leaving behind the dust-covered town and the cold stares of strangers. Clara sat beside Samuel, clutching a worn cloth sack that held the few scraps she owned. In her dress pocket, the wedding ring lay quiet as a piece of her heart. The dry wind of the prairie struck her face, but next to this silent man, the weight of her hunger and weariness seemed to ease, if only a little. They rode near an hour before the fences came into view, running long along the sun-bleached pasture. In the distance, a cluster of wooden buildings caught the slant of evening light. Samuel pulled on the reins, his voice low and steady. "We're here." Clara lifted her gaze. Before her stood a modest homestead, a 2-story house with weathered shingles, its window frames stripped of paint. Beside it stood a horse barn, a line of sheds, and a yard beaten hard by hoof prints. Cattle grazed far off, their calls carried thin by the wind. It was no grand spread, not enough to call rich, yet it carried the look of endurance, a place that had met heat and hail and still stood its ground. Samuel stepped down first and offered his hand. His palm was rough, his grip firm but never forcing. Clara nodded faintly as her feet touched the dirt yard. In that moment, she felt the sharp cut of crossing into another life. The front door swung open. A tall, silver-haired man, shoulders broad though bent with age, stepped out to the porch. His eyes were deep, sharp as a cleaver, and with a single glance at Clara, he seemed to see more than she wished revealed. Not cruel, not careless, just cutting. Samuel gave the introduction in his plain way. "Pa, this is Clara Whitmore. She'll be working in the kitchen." The man dipped his chin, his voice gravelly and short. "Jacob Grant." Clara lowered her head. "Yes, sir." Jacob asked no more. He jerked his chin toward the side building. "The kitchen. See what you can make of it." Her heart thudded as she followed. The door swung wide, and the smell struck, sharp and scorched. A large room, shadowed and stale. Shelves lined with dust, plates stacked dirty, pans blackened, the stove cold and ashen. The floor littered with gray soot. On the table, pieces of hardened salt pork sat forgotten among rusted knives. It was less a kitchen than a record of meals eaten without care, days endured rather than lived. Clara froze. The sight pressed down like heavy fog. Was this to be her place? A hollow kitchen, dead and cold, like her own life laid bare. Behind her, Samuel's voice came quiet, without urging. "It's been left a long while. We boiled beans, cooked meat outside. No one had the patience for more." Her fingers touched the tabletop, came away gray with dust. Something stirred in her chest. The disorder, the neglect. It mirrored her. Abandoned. Unclaimed. Yet she felt the thought rise unbidden. With work, a fire might burn here again. She drew a breath. Fear still clung. But with it came a thread of chance. No one in this house expected miracles from a stranger widow. But that gave her a freedom too. There was nothing left to lose. If she made it, she'd belong. If not, she'd return to the emptiness she already knew. She turned to Jacob, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "I'll tend the kitchen." His eyes gave nothing, but the corner of his mouth tightened, a flicker of assent. Samuel set down the bundle he had carried from town, flour, beans, salt pork, a little sugar, and slid it toward her. "A start. Tomorrow you can put things in order." Clara nodded, arms quivering as she held the basket. To her it was treasure, more than she'd seen in weeks. Evening light poured through the dusty panes and fell across her face. For the first time in many months, she looked at a place not as burden, but as possibility. Among dead ashes, she could strike a flame, and from cold stone, perhaps, build a life again. Evening settled quiet across the Grant place, stretching the shadows of old fences long over the pasture. Clara stood alone in the dim kitchen, a worn broom in her hand, her eyes sweeping across the ruin before her. The room was a battlefield abandoned, dishes piled high, pots blackened with soot, cobwebs laced across the windows. The air hung thick with the sour blend of cold ash and rancid grease. Yet she gripped the broom tighter. It felt as though the room itself was testing her. If she could bring this kitchen back to life, she could do the same for herself. She began with the dishes, hauling them out to the well. The water bit cold against her raw hands, but she scrubbed each plate, dried it, and stacked it neat. Back inside, she swept the floor, gathered the dead embers, bent low to the old iron stove. It was choked with dust, but still solid enough to hold flame. She laid dry kindling, coaxed the spark, and blew until the fire caught. The glow rose quick and strong, red gold light dancing against gray walls. The warmth spread, and her heart pounded with it, each beat whispering the same truth. She was not yet extinguished. That first night, there was little to work with. From Samuel's basket she chose beans, a strip of salt pork, a measure of flour. Plain fare, but if handled right, it might remind weary men that supper could bring comfort. She rinsed the beans, left them to simmer, cut the pork thin and laid it in the pan. The sizzle rose sharp and hearty, the smell of fat filling the room. Her own stomach, long emptied, ached at the scent. She worked the flour into rough loaves, set them near the oven's heat. The smell of bread joined the pork and beans, rising together like a hymn sung in that once silent room. Sweat beaded her brow, yet she smiled faintly. Out of scraps, she had summoned something that stirred memory, meals with Thomas in the small house she had lost. Footsteps sounded on the porch, ranch hands returning from a long day beneath the sun. Their talk and laughter carried, but fell off when the scent reached them. Silence lingered, disbelief sharpening their eyes. It had been a long time since this kitchen had lived. When they entered, the table had been wiped down, bowls lined in order. Clara served them careful portions, bean stew, bread crusty at the edges, pork browned crisp. No word was spoken as they sat. Then the first spoon scraped the bowl. They ate. For a moment, the room held still. Then one man with a bristled beard sniffed, gave a slow nod. Another let out a satisfied breath. Young Eli, eyes wide, bit into bread and gave a soft cheer before catching himself. Soon spoons clinked, voices lifted, and laughter broke against the walls. Clara stood apart, her chest full. After months of being overlooked, she was needed again. The looks of rough men softened with thanks, and in them she felt the truth. She was more than just a shadow passing through. A tear slipped, but she brushed it quick, leaving only her quiet smile. Later, when the table had emptied, she set to cleaning once more. Pulling open a drawer for a cloth, her fingers touched something soft. She drew it out. A handkerchief, ivory white, edges stitched fine with a single letter. E. Clara froze. That lone initial, delicate yet sharp, carried a presence she had not expected. Another woman's trace lingered here. She did not know who, yet the sense of someone else's claim crept through the room. The fire in the stove burned steady, but inside her, unease began to stir. Morning spread across Kansas in a pale gold light, the wind carrying the sweet scent of freshly cut hay from the fields. Clara was bent over her work in the kitchen when she heard boots on the porch. The door eased open, and Samuel stepped in. Tall, lean, dust clinging to his work shirt, his hair tousled from a dawn spent in the pasture. In his hands, to her surprise, was a small bundle of wildflowers still damp with dew, yellow daisies mixed with tiny purple blooms. Nothing fancy, but held carefully, as though he had weighed the gesture a long time before bringing them to her. Samuel stood a moment, uncertain. His voice was low, roughened by the morning wind. "I thought the place might look brighter with something softer in it." Clara froze. For months no one had offered her anything but pity or scorn. And here was this man, awkward in manner, choosing wildflowers to give. She reached out, the rough stems scratching her skin, yet warmth unfurled in her chest. She found a small clay jar, rinsed it clean, and set the flowers inside, placing them on the kitchen sill beside the stove. Sunlight poured through, striking the yellow petals until the dim kitchen seemed touched with breath again, every shadow lifted by color. Clara watched, her heart swelling with a feeling she could not name. That night, supper was set out. Bean stew and salt pork again, but this time with a fresh loaf of bread and a pot of greens Clara had gathered from the garden behind the house. Around the table sat them all, Samuel beside Jacob, the ranch hands along the sides, and young Eli bright-eyed between them. The steam from the food mingled with the scrape of spoons, a hum of life replacing the silence that had once ruled the room. Then a laugh broke from Samuel when Eli told of a colt kicking up that afternoon. Jacob cleared his throat, but even his mouth bent at the corner. The hands burst into laughter, their voices echoing against timber walls that had only known the hollow sound of wind. Clara sat still, listening. Since Thomas's death, she had not believed laughter could cut darkness so clean. She looked at the table, the sunburnt faces, rough hands, eyes eased by food and fire, and felt it. She was stepping into a family not by blood, but by bread and warmth shared at a common table. When the meal ended, one of the older hands lingered. He tapped his spoon against the bowl, half smiling. Truth be told, this stew takes me back. Elizabeth used to throw in a bit of herb the same way. Samuel, you remember? The air thinned. Clara froze, dish in hand. Elizabeth. The name struck like a stone on still water. Silence spread. Samuel only nodded once, offering no words. The man sensed his misstep, chuckled awkwardly, and rose, changing the subject. But Clara could not let it go. In her mind, the embroidered E on the handkerchief she had found lit up plain. Elizabeth, Samuel's former betrothed, the woman who had left her mark in small things still tucked about this house, threads and traces that lingered. Clara bent to her task again, though unease pulled at her. The wildflowers shone bright in the lamplight, yet another woman's memory stood among them, sharper now than ever. Clara felt no jealousy, only a quiet weight pressing her chest. Would she ever truly belong here, or always walk inside another's shadow? Outside, the night wind whispered through the fields. Inside, the fire burned steady, its warmth rising into the beams of the Grant home. Clara touched the rim of the flower jar, her finger brushing a daisy's petal. She told herself she would have to learn to light the room with what was hers, even if the past still lingered in its corners. That evening's supper came later than usual. A midday storm had left puddles thick around the corrals, and the men worked long to bring the herd in. When Clara set the pot of beans on the table, hooves had only just gone still in the yard. The smell of damp earth and sweat drifted inside with them, mingling with the heat of food, filling the kitchen with a plain, living warmth. She served each plate in turn. The chipped dishes held bread fresh from the oven, slices of salt pork, a handful of greens boiled soft. No feast, but sound and full, something she had once forgotten to value. At the far end of the table, Eli sat bright-eyed, hunger sparking like light behind them. The orphan boy rarely spoke much, but since Clara's arrival, he had grown bold enough to linger in the kitchen, fetching water or picking vegetables, only to hear her gentle voice. Tonight, the golden loaf on his plate seemed too little. As Clara set down the last piece, he lifted his face and spoke clear as breath itself. "Could I have another, Mama?" The word carried clean across the table. Every hand stilled. The scrape of cutlery ceased. Only the fire cracked in the stove. Samuel's knife stopped halfway down. Jacob's brow drew tight, his eyes sharp as steel, but not in anger, only in surprise. Eli flushed crimson, head dropping quick, his small hands twisting together. Clara's chest swelled heavy, then light. She did not scold. Instead, tenderness rose and blurred her sight. She set another piece of bread on his plate, smiling as though nothing had happened. "Eat, son," she said, her voice even, though something in it struck Samuel's heart off balance. The spell broke. Talk returned in low tones. Someone teased Hank about eating more than the cattle he drove, and laughter spilled around the table. The strain of a moment lifted, like a cloud passing from the sky. Yet within Clara, the stir did not fade. For the first time since coming here, she had been named by something new, a role not hers, yet spoken as if it had been waiting for her. Mother. A word she had not expected, and yet it landed as natural as if it belonged. Clearing dishes, she felt Samuel's gaze cross her more than once, not in judgment, nor in censure, more as if he were measuring something in himself he had no name for yet. Later, with the house quiet, Clara sat by the stove, her fingers tracing the worn hem of the tablecloth. The word echoed again, the voice of a boy who had meant no harm, but who had seen in her something warm enough to call by that name. Since Thomas's passing, she had lived only as a widow, stripped of every other claim, and now a child had placed another mantle on her shoulders. Her hand rose to her chest, steadying the swell of feeling. There was joy, yes, in no longer being adrift. Yet fear, too. Fear of failing at a name she had not sought, when her own wounds still bled inside. The wind pressed at the shutters, carrying the smell of hay and the chirr of crickets. Clara lifted her eyes to the window, where Samuel's wildflowers still stood in the clay jar. The petals had begun to wilt, yet the yellow still caught the lamplight, and she saw herself in them, set in a new vessel, a new home, a hearth not her own, yet offering color despite the scars. The laughter at supper, the boy's unmeant word, all marked a turning. She was no longer an outsider. Fragile as a sprout in dry earth, something had begun. In the hush, Clara wondered, could she truly belong here? Or was she only a guest, draped for now in the borrowed role of mother and keeper of the fire, until memory of another woman rose again? The fire cracked, sending warmth through the room. It seemed to answer in its own way, that truth would not be found in one night, but in the days yet to come. And for the first time, Clara did not turn from the question. Summer nights stretched long, yet on the Kansas plains, darkness always fell quicker than folks could ready for it. The fire in the stove had gone cold. The men of the ranch turned in. Only Clara lingered in the kitchen, her hands still faintly scented of lye soap after scrubbing pots. Outside, the wind hissed along the porch, carrying the damp breath of wild grass. A horse whinnied from the barn, a restless sound reminding her the land beyond still held its wild edge. Inside the old timber house, she sat alone, the lamplight casting her figure thin and wavering against the wall. In these days, she had begun to feel Samuel's presence more keenly. He spoke little, yet his eyes softened whenever they found her. Once his hand brushed hers while steadying a pan, and her heart stumbled out of rhythm. His kindness was quiet, but enough to stir warmth in a heart gone cold too long. Yet her own past clung like a binding rope. At night, Thomas returned in memory, his gaunt face burning with fever, the rasp of his cough, the silence that followed his last breath. The ring, her only keepsake, still lay hidden in her dress pocket. A single touch to it, and the wound opened fresh. That night, as she tidied, Clara stepped into the small side room where Samuel kept his Bible upon a plain wooden shelf. She had meant only to fetch a cloth, but when she pulled the book free, Loose papers slipped to the floor. She bent, lifted them into the lamplight. The handwriting, tilted but clear, cut through the yellowed page. Samuel, I cannot stay. Life here is too hard. I once thought love could be enough, but I was wrong. I must leave before this land buries me. Elizabeth. Clara stood rigid, her heart hammering as though gripped in a fist. The name, Elizabeth, no longer a ghost hinted at in an embroidered letter, but written plain in farewell. Another woman, once bound to Samuel, had turned away and left her mark. Her hand trembled as she held the letter. Sitting down, she let the lamp bear each line, each blurred stroke of ink. She pictured Elizabeth, perhaps strong, perhaps fair, once holding Samuel's trust in full, and then choosing to leave. Jealousy welled, sharp and unbidden. She felt herself small, temporary, a figure come after only to fill the hollow. The memory of Samuel setting wildflowers on the sill now clashed with the paper in her hand, and pain struck deep. Was his gentleness toward her only a pattern repeated, a way to mask the shadow of another? She closed her eyes, breathing slow, but the ache did not ease. In her chest swelled a muted grief, pity for herself and pity for him. Clara laid the letter back inside the Bible, closing it with care. But her heart no longer rested as it had before. Each footstep echoed heavy across the silent house, as if the past itself thudded close behind. That night, lying on the narrow cot by the kitchen, sleep would not come. The wind carried its whispers through the cracks like mockery. She thought of Thomas, of the hidden ring, of Elizabeth. Gone yet present in a sheet of paper no thicker than breath. In the dark, she knew her path was more than tending meals and washing clothes. It was a walk through shadows, her own grief, and Samuel's too. Tonight, that shadow had taken form in a name drawn from an old letter. Turning on her side, she stared at the beams above, lamplight spilling faint through the doorframe, not enough to scatter the dark. Tears slid along her temple unchecked. Not anger at Samuel, but fear, that she would forever remain a figure behind another woman's ghost. Yet even through the hurt, a small flame endured, the will to prove her place, to show her presence carried worth, not merely to fill a void left by someone else. That summer night lay still as old parchment. Darkness pressed down over the timber house, broken only by the rasp of crickets in the grass and the sigh of wind slipping through the cracks. Clara sat by the stove, folding the last of the washed cloths. Her hands moved steady, but her mind was restless. The letter she had found, the slanted hand of Elizabeth, haunted her still. Silence deepened when Samuel came in. He carried the dust of the fields, the cool of night clinging to his shirt. His eyes did not go to her first. They went straight to the shelf where the old Bible rested. He stopped before it, laying his weathered hand on the cover. For a long moment, he stood without a word. Clara froze, the cloth sliding from her lap. The stove crackled low, and when Samuel opened the book, she knew what he would find. The thin sheet of paper showed again, a ghost of another life. He did not read it. He did not sigh. He looked once, then closed the book, his face calm but his eyes heavy. Without speaking, he crossed to the fire. The flame leapt as though waiting for him, painting his features in lines of weariness and resolve. He held the letter to the blaze. The paper curled, blackened, whispering as the fire devoured each word. Clara watched, still as stone, while the ghost of Elizabeth turned to ash and rose in a faint smoke up the chimney. Samuel turned then. His gaze met hers, asking and confessing at once. He sat beside her, close enough that she could hear the tremor in his breath. "Enough," he said low, his voice deep as earth. "Enough for the past to lie quiet." Clara swallowed hard. Relief, wonder, and a rush of feeling all tangled inside her. She had feared she was only a shadow to replace another. Yet here he was, cutting the tie himself, not with speeches, but with fire. Her voice came soft, almost a whisper. "You don't fear regret?" He looked into the fading glow. "Some things, if kept, dry a man to dust. I will not wither any more." The words struck her heart. His eyes were different now, not those of a man left behind, but of one who had chosen to step forward. The room fell still but for the popping of wood. Clara felt herself tremble, not with chill, but with the strength of her own pulse. Samuel turned, his voice quiet yet clear. "Clara, I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I know this. I want you beside me, not as a passing fill, not as a ghost's stand-in, because I have chosen you." Her throat tightened. The doubts, the fear, the fog of another woman's name, all began to lift. She raised her eyes to him. His shadow stretched tall and steady against the wall, his dark gaze fixed without flinching. "Samuel," she breathed, his name spoken light as air. "I want the same. I want to live in what is here, not in ashes." He reached then, slow and careful, as though wary she might pull away. She did not. Her hand found his. Rough met fragile, fitting close, as if it had always been meant. They needed no more words. Samuel leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss neither hurried nor fierce, but deep, a vow made in silence. The past was done, and something new had begun. Clara closed her eyes, letting herself rest in the rare peace of it. Within the kiss, she heard the unspoken promise that they had chosen each other, here and now. Outside, the night wind moved over the prairie, carrying the scent of soil cooled after heat. The letter was gone, nothing left but a trace of ash on the hearth. But in their hearts, another fire had taken hold, not of what had been, but of what could be, and the will to keep it. September opened with mornings of cool wind, the scent of ripened corn drifting across the fields. Kansas had shed its searing heat, trading it for a honey-gold sun laid soft upon wooden rooftops. In such air, the county stirred with anticipation for the harvest fair, the one gathering each year that drew even the most solitary farms to town. For years, the Grants had stayed away. Since Mrs. Grant's passing, Jacob and Samuel kept to themselves, shunning the noise of crowds. But this year was different. There was Clara in the kitchen, laughter returning to the porch, a change too plain to ignore. It was Jacob himself who said, "We should go." The words came clipped, but in his eyes Samuel caught a glint he had not seen in years. That morning, Clara stood before a small mirror in her room. Her hand trembled as it touched the blue dress Jacob had given her. Samuel's mother wore it to fairs and church, Jacob had told her in his rough but softened tone. She believed clothes were not only to cover, but to remind a woman she deserves her place among folks. The dress was simple, its fabric worn smooth by time, yet its seams still strong, embroidery at the cuffs neat and steady. Slipping it on, Clara felt as though she carried a piece of the woman who once kept this very hearth. She tied the sash at her waist, a mix of strangeness and closeness settling in her chest, as if unseen hands steadied her shoulders. When she came down, Samuel was waiting on the porch. He wore a white shirt, black vest, boots shined against the morning light. For a breath his eyes held fast, caught by the sight of her framed in the sun, the blue cloth soft against her thin form, a wildflower standing stubborn from hard earth. He spoke no word, only offered his arm. Clara set her hand in his, warmth flowing steady through his grip. Holbrook's square brimmed with life. Colored flags whipped in the wind. Fiddles struck lively tunes from the saloon porch. Children chased one another through the sweet air of taffy and pies. Stalls brimmed with corn, pumpkins, apples bright as fire, and jars of honey glowing like light itself. When the Grant's wagon drew up, heads turned. Whispered words passed like wind. Samuel Grant, the man who had kept his distance, was here with a young black widow at his side. Clara felt each gaze, curious, doubtful, some sharp with disapproval. She faltered, but Samuel's hand closed firm around hers. He did not meet the stares. He leaned toward her, his voice steady. "Walk with me. Hold your head high." And she did, step by step, through the undercurrent of murmurs. They moved among the stalls, Eli darting ahead, delighting at giant pumpkins and steaming pies. Jacob followed, his frame stooped but still commanding, nodding curtly at old acquaintances. By afternoon, the square cleared space for dancing. The fiddle quickened, drums beat, boots struck earth in rhythm, and the crowd joined hands, circling in joy beneath the wide, blue sky. Clara stood at the edge, clutching her shawl. Laughter of women, glances sliding sharp, the whispers, "Isn't that Widow Whitmore?" all pressed her back. She longed for shadow. But as the music shifted into a slow waltz, Samuel came to her. He held out his hand. Not a speech, only plain words. "Dance with me." Clara lifted her eyes. His gaze was steady as a sky after storm, carrying a tenderness he rarely showed. Her heart stammered, and with a breath, she laid her hand in his. He led her into the circle. Murmurs rose again, but this time she did not let them bind her. His hand rested light on her back, guiding her steps, and she found the rhythm, graceful, sure, nothing of the awkwardness she had feared. Boots tapped, her dress swept across the stone, and when she looked up, Samuel was watching her. In his eyes she read not pity, not duty, but choice. Here, in front of all, he had chosen her. The tune ended, and they came still. For a heartbeat, silence held. Then came clapping, cheers from some, scowls from others. But Clara felt light, lifted. She was no longer hiding at the edge. She was in the circle, hand in hand with Samuel. The sun dipped low, gilding his hair, setting him as though carved from light and shadow. Clara's hand tightened on his, and she knew she was no guest in the Grant kitchen. She had stepped truly into this family's life. Music still rang lively across Holbrook Square. The fiddle quickened, boots struck hard against brick, and couples turned in tight circles. The air was sweet with baked pies and caramel apples, children darting between grown legs, laughter filling every gap only to be swallowed again by more laughter. Clara stood beside Samuel, her heart still beating fast from the dance. His hand had held hers, openly, in sight of all. The mark of it still warmed her, a mix of shyness and relief. To be seen, to be chosen, after so many months of shadow, was a peace she had not known. But from the edge of the crowd came a figure who carried with him a weight that stilled the air. The man was broad-shouldered, a little past 30, his face cut deep with lines not from age but from long years worn thin. His coat bore dust, his boots the marks of distance. It was his eyes, dark and hollow as a dry well, that stopped Clara cold. There was something in them she knew, sharp as grief. He halted before her, pulling off his hat, twisting it in his hands. His voice rasped low, rough enough to cut through the noise. "Clara Whitmore?" The old name landed like a blade. Clara staggered faintly, and Samuel stepped in half a pace, his hand brushing firm against her back, shielding. "Yes," she answered, her voice unsteady. "I am Clara." The man nodded, his gaze dropping. "I'm Nathaniel Carter, Thomas's brother." The world slowed. Music played, folks laughed, yet Clara's ears filled with a dull roar. Thomas. The name pierced her chest, tearing open the past. Missouri nights, his hand in hers in the little church, his breath fading in fever's grip. "Brother," she whispered, lips dry. Nathaniel drew a breath and reached inside his coat. He pulled out a letter, wrinkled and stained, never sealed, its corners torn. His large hands shook as he held it out. "Before he passed, he tried to write you. Fever stole his strength. He couldn't finish. I kept it, waiting for the day I could give it to you." Clara took it as though it were ash. Her hands trembled, not from the paper's weight, but from the burden of memory it carried. She opened it. Thomas's hand was there, slanted, fading, but his all the same. "Clara, my dear, I know my time is short. I grieve that I cannot spare you sorrow. If you live, live fully. Do not let my shadow bind you. Find a home, find a man to love, and do not fear to begin again. I love you. Thomas." The words broke off mid-line, ink smudged as if by breath cut short. Clara pressed the letter to her chest. The fare blurred away, sound fell distant, leaving only the fire of his words in her heart. Tears slid down, falling against the blue cloth at her breast. She whispered, soft but steady, as if speaking to the grave left behind in Missouri. "Thank you, Thomas." Not in mourning, not in pleading, in gratitude, for love, for memory, for the release he had given. Samuel stood at her side, silent, witness. He did not speak, only reached for her hand. His fingers clasped hers, warm, unyielding, drawing her from the whirl of grief back to the present. Clara did not resist. Though her cheeks were wet, her hand answered his hold. In loss, there was comfort. In sorrow, the seed of hope. Nathaniel watched, his own eyes rimmed with wet. He set his hat back on, stepped away. "Then I can rest easy. He doesn't have to worry for you anymore." Clara nodded, clutching the letter. "You've given me Thomas's last gift. I'll keep it, as I keep the life we shared." The man gave a single nod, nothing more, then turned, fading into the crowd, leaving silence in his wake amid the fair's noise. That night, lanterns swung high and the fiddle struck up again. Clara sat on a wooden bench at the edge of the square, the letter folded in her lap. Samuel sat beside her, no urging, only present, knowing his quiet was the truest companion she needed. At last she lifted her face, eyes wet but shining. She closed her hand firm around his. This time it did not tremble. "He wanted me to live," she said, voice low, "to live fully. And I think I've begun." Samuel said nothing. He bent his head and kissed her hand, plain, steady, carrying weight more than words. Above them, fireworks burst wide, scattering light across the Kansas sky. And Clara felt herself standing at the border of two lives, one closed in tears, the other just opening, in the grip of the man beside her. After the harvest fair, Holbrook had plenty to talk about. Not the winning pies or the spinning couples, but the moment Samuel Grant clasped Clara Whitmore's hand before the whole town. A simple gesture, yet it said all that needed saying. All had seen it. All understood. The next day, as Clara walked the main street for flour, nods came different. Where once eyes had carried doubt or guarded curiosity, now there was something warmer, recognition, even welcome. From the boarding house porch, Mrs. Donnelly called out, her voice bright, "Child, Samuel Grant's a good man. Hold on tight to him." Clara flushed, smiling shy as she quickened her steps. But inside her chest, a small flame burned, steady as a candle no hand could hide. One late afternoon, not long after the fair, Samuel came into the kitchen where Clara was sifting flour. He did not circle his words, nor hide behind silence. He stood before her, dust of grass still on his sleeves, his prairie blue eyes set firm. "Clara," his voice was roughened, "you are not only the keeper of this kitchen. You are the breath in this house. Will you be my wife?" No flowers, no ring held forth. Only a plain man, honest as earth, giving her his heart entire. Clara set the basket down, her flour-stained hands trembling. In that instant she heard again Thomas's unfinished words, the ones his brother had placed in her hands. "If you live, live fully." She lifted her eyes, tears brimming but steady. "Yes, Samuel, I will." Nothing more was needed. Two souls, once hollowed by loss, now found one another. In that fire-lit kitchen, they claimed not only their bond, but their place before the town that had watched them. The news ran faster than Kansas wind, and when Jacob Grant gave his nod, the matter was sealed. A wedding would be held, not grand, not gilded, but as plain and steadfast as the land itself. The day dawned cloudless, sky spread wide like a blessing. Chairs were set in rows before the house, draped with old white cloths drawn from trunks. A bower of wildflowers stood hastily woven, their scent riding the prairie breeze. Clara wore a dress of pale ivory, mended by her own hands from cloth Mrs. Donnelly had gifted. No lace, no silk, only clean lines and simple grace. In her hair, Jacob placed a small clip once belonging to his late wife, passed on in quiet benediction. When Clara stepped out, the crowd hushed. Samuel stood beneath the bower, tall and spare as an oak. His eyes on her spoke all his certainty, no need of words. Vows were spoken plain, with only kin and neighbors gathered, ranch hands, townsfolk, those who had shared bread at her table. No loud weeping, only shining eyes and the clap of hands like wind rushing through the grass. Samuel took her hand, slipping on a plain band of gold. "Not as a replacement," he murmured, "but to begin a chapter with you." Clara bowed her head. She thought of Thomas's ring, tucked away in her drawer. She had laid it, there before this day, not buried, not forgotten, but kept as foundation stone for the steps ahead. Her gaze lifted, clear and resolute. Yes, Samuel. Their kiss was brief but deep, sealing more than their bond. It bound Clara at last to this land that once seemed foreign. The feast was humble, long tables set with bean stew, bread, roasted meat. Fiddles played, children laughed, men sang after corn whiskey. It was joy shared, not for one pair alone, but for the rebirth of a household. Clara sat at the center, her eyes sweeping the faces. Eli, cheeks puffed with pie. Mrs. Donnelly, laughing like a girl again. Even Jacob, solemn so often, raised his cup and declared, "The Grant house has a home once more." Clara's hand found Samuel's beneath the table, gripping firm. She knew the words were for her as much as for him. That night, when the guests were gone and lanterns dimmed, Clara stood in the kitchen, gazing at the heart of the house. The fire glowed bright. Pots hung neat. The wildflowers Samuel had once given still stood at the sill. All seemed to sing a quiet hymn of welcome. She opened the drawer. The old ring gleamed faint beneath the lamplight. Touching it, she felt no sting, only a gentle ache, softened into gratitude. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered, and closed it again. Outside, Samuel called softly. She turned and found him waiting, tall in the doorway, his smile warm. He held out his hand, and she stepped to him, her own hand fitting without thought. Together they walked onto the porch. Above, stars spilled across the Kansas sky. Clara leaned against him, whispering, "Now I know I belong." Samuel's arm held her close. "From this day, none of us stands alone." And in the tender dark, with the fire still burning inside, a home was born anew. Plain, steadfast, and strong enough to shelter souls weathered by loss. From the day of the wedding, the Grant kitchen never lost its fire. At dawn, while prairie fog still drifted low, one could hear the crackle of kindling in the stove and smell coffee drifting across the porch. By noon, bread rose warm and fragrant, and Eli's laughter darted through the door like a colt at play. At night, lamplight spilled from the kitchen window, a small beacon set against the wide sea of grass. Clara was no longer just the cook. She was the heart of the house. Her hands, once calloused by hardship, now moved sure over dough and fire. Every meal filled not only empty bellies, but long empty spirits. The ranch hands, hardened men who had forgotten the taste of home, found in her suppers something steady to return to. Eli lingered close, his round eyes never straying far from her. Once Clara overheard him whisper to Samuel, thinking she would not hear, "With Mama here, I feel safe." Samuel said nothing, only laid a hand on the boy's shoulder and pressed firm. Clara turned her face toward the pot, tears pricking, and stirred the soup with a quiet smile. Even Jacob, the sternest of them, softened. Where once he kept his distance, he now sat evenings in the kitchen, sipping black coffee and listening to the laughter that filled the room. His brow stayed lined, but no longer shadowed. One night, he set down his cup and said simply, "This house, it burns bright again." The words fell plain, but all at the table knew they were blessing. The men learned to take their part in the hearth. Billy mastered the fire, Samuel the steady stir of the pot, Hank clumsy enough to drop a spoon in the stew, drawing laughter that shook the rafters. Clara never scolded. She told them, This kitchen belongs to all of us. The more hands, the stronger the fire. And they believed it. The town, too, came to see differently. On Sundays, as Clara walked into the chapel with Samuel, there were nods, smiles, plates of sweet bread offered freely. No longer the wary looks of old. Folks whispered that Samuel had chosen well. Samuel, hearing it, only turned his eyes to Clara, as if to say, "They don't know. It was you who chose me." That winter, when wind whipped hard and snow climbed high, the Grant kitchen became a refuge. They gathered close by the fire, listening to Clara's Missouri stories, to Eli stumbling through lines of scripture, to Samuel mending a chair with steady hands that paused often just to look at her. Outside the storm raged, but inside the pot simmered, firelight glowing across faces that no longer looked lost. One evening, as bread cooled on the table, Samuel leaned against the doorframe, watching Clara move with quiet grace. His voice came slow, rough but certain. "Gold can't buy a home, but love and courage, that can." Silence followed, filled only by the whisper of wind. Clara lifted her gaze, meeting his. No applause, no reply was needed. It was truth already lived. The next day, with sunlight spilled across the fields, Clara stood at the kitchen window, turning the plain wedding band upon her finger. Not as bright as Thomas's ring once was, but steady, warm, as the hand that had placed it. Beyond, the prairie burned gold beneath the setting sun. Eli's laughter rang as he chased horses through the pasture. Jacob bent beneath a tree, mending tack. Samuel strode from the barn, tall and spare, carrying quiet strength in every step. Clara pressed her hand to the glass, peace rising in her chest. She was no longer the lost widow with only hunger and memory. She was the soul of this house, and from sorrow she had built her beginning again. Her smile broke soft across her face, fading into the red gold light until she seemed part of it, and she knew the flame of this hearth would never die. Perhaps, hearing this tale, you recall a kitchen of your own, where the fire never failed, where children's laughter mixed with the clink of spoons, where a home was built not from timber or stone, but from love and courage. Clara, once adrift, had found her faith again, and a hearth to call her own. And Samuel's words may yet speak for us all. Gold cannot buy a home, but love and courage can. If this story touched your heart, share your memories below. Have you known the warmth of a hand reaching at the right time? We'd be honored to hear. And don't forget to like and subscribe, so together we may keep these stories burning bright. For in the end, love and kindness are the truest legacy we leave behind.